The true drama of our nation does not always play out in the Oval Office's golden light. Often, it plays out in the humid, echoing silence beneath the cobblestones, where the foundation of the White House meets the sacred earth of the Capitol. I stand before you, having spent a lifetime coaxing secrets from history's shadows, and I tell you that we are not just a country. We are a dream built on granite and ambition, and every great dream has its foundations hidden from the light. We built the Executive Mansion to be a beacon, a shining symbol of liberty and openness. But even beacons need anchors. They need protection. And from the very first stone laid, the architects of our dream understood that for this grand experiment to survive, it needed escape routes, arteries for intelligence, and command posts shielded from chaos. They understood the necessity of the shadow government, not of men, but of stone and mortar, a hidden hand guiding the destiny of our collective we. This is the chronicle of those hidden spaces, the subterranean symphony that has orchestrated the continuity of our American saga, from the nervous infancy of our republic to the complex digital age of today. The story begins with James Hoban, the original architect, a man of grand vision, yes, but also a man marked by the necessary paranoia that accompanies the birth of every republic. Hoban, working under the watchful eye of President John Adams, and later Thomas Jefferson, didn't just design rooms for state dinners, he designed layers of retreat. He saw the fragility of our new order, the jealousy of foreign powers, and the volatility of our own political passions. He didn't trust that the Executive Mansion, for all its majesty, would be safe. He planned for its desecration and its defense in the same breath. The initial subterranean network, rudimentary, certainly, but undeniably vital, wasn't built for comfort. It was built for necessity. Hoban gathered a small, tight-lipped crew, Irish stonemasons who understood the integrity of bedrock and the sanctity of silence. They dug not wide, comfortable passages, but two main arteries, low-ceilinged and roughly hewn, smelling perpetually of cold, damp earth and lime mortar. The first passage ran eastward, starting from the nascent basement of the East Wing, then a simple service area, a kitchen and storage depot, stretching silently toward the massive, reassuring bulk of the Treasury building. This was the fiscal artery, the route for the immediate extraction of specie, contracts, and the young nation's ledgers. It was practical, necessary, and comparatively easier to mask. But the second passage, however, was the truly clandestine route. It led westward, a tighter, lower crawlway designed to be easily missed, intended to connect to a secret military cache near the Potomac, a bolt hole where a president could establish a temporary command or make a final desperate flight. For nearly 15 years, these tunnels were simply dormant architecture, a contingency, a whispered just in case. They were forgotten by most, maintained only by a handful of trusted engineers who inherited the secret. Then came the glorious, defining moment that cemented the tunnel's purpose, August 1814. The War of 1812 had reached its terrible, inevitable climax. The British Army was advancing on Washington, D.C. The air was thick with smoke, anxiety, and the terrifying crimson glow of burning buildings. It was our nation's first, true existential test of survival, a test whether the dream was made of gossamer or steel. History focuses, rightly, on Dolly Madison, the First Lady whose courage rivals any general. We remember her famously ensuring the preservation of Gilbert Stuart's portrait of George Washington. But she wasn't just saving art for posterity. She was initiating the protocols of continuity of government for the first time, an act of sheer, glorious American resolve. The official story is that the documents were taken out by wagon, a charming, brave tale designed for daylight consumption. The dramatic, glorious truth, however, unfolded entirely in the suffocating darkness below. While the carriage carried the distraction, trundling publicly along Pennsylvania Avenue, the essential core of the young government, the early treaties penned in shaky but defiant hands, the most sensitive diplomatic correspondence that defined our global standing, was rushed through Hoban Western Passage. The Marine detail assigned to the task, barely 20 men, moved like shadows. They descended into the cold cellar, the roar of the fire above them now muffled to a terrifying internal thrum. The tunnel air was heavy and stagnant, scented with wet stone and fear. They moved quickly, not daring to use lamps for fear of betraying their presence through ventilation shafts. They relied on muscle memory and the faint lines of light filtering through unexpected cracks, each man gripping a small, weighted leather pouch containing the Republic's secrets. Every turn, every echo of a scuffing boot on the packed earth was an agonizing delay. The passage was barely tall enough for a man to walk stooped, and the fear was not of the enemy, but of a structural collapse, of being buried with the very foundation of the Republic. This journey was a desperate prayer. They were carrying the soul of America in the dark. And then, the emergence. When the detail finally breached the tunnel's western terminus, they found themselves in a silent copse of trees near the river. The air was suddenly cool and fresh. They looked back across the darkness of the city and saw the White House, the proud symbol of our unity, wreathed in brilliant, hungry flames. The sight was devastating, a vision of the American dream reduced to ash. But the feeling that followed, the surge of patriotic, defiant pride, was glorious. The documents were safe. The essential heart of our operations had been secreted away, preserved in the American night. The tunnels worked. They preserved the essential. We survived. The physical structure burned, but the constitutional spirit, guarded in the dark, endured. If the tunnels were a matter of survival in 1814, they became an instrument of command and control during the agonizing trial of the Civil War. By 1861, the network had been quietly expanded and subtly fortified. A true brick lining had replaced much of the rough-hewn stone in key areas, and small specialized subrooms, little more than underground closets, had been constructed for temporary storage or quick, unobserved conversations. The tunnels were waiting for their most burdened resident. President Abraham Lincoln, a man whose gaunt frame seemed to carry the physical weight of a fracturing nation, used the sunlit above-ground White House for appearances and necessary ceremony. But the true, grinding operations of war, the sleepless, anguished decisions, were often shifted underground. Washington, D.C. was less a capital and more a viper pit of spies. Confederate agents, double agents, Northern copperheads, and political adversaries lurked in every drawing room and behind every lace curtain. The risk of moving sensitive intelligence via the surface, of having a courier intercepted or a code word overheard, was a risk the president could not afford. The war was too close, the stakes too high. The expanded tunnel leading directly toward the old War Department, now the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, became known to a select few simply as the conduit. It was a silent pathway of absolute trust. Imagine a late night in the winter of 1862. The snow is falling on the Capitol, softening the sound of the distant cannon fire that has become the city's constant, heartbreaking bass note. The clock is striking 2 a.m. President Lincoln, unable to sleep, his eyes hollowed out by weeks of crushing casualty reports, leaves the residence side. He moves slowly, his signature tall hat brushing the ceiling of the low passage.
He is accompanied by only 2 men, a trusted aide carrying a lantern that throws dancing, erratic shadows on the damp brick, and a single silent Marine armed with a Spencer rifle. The air here is cold, still, and heavy with the pervasive smell of earth, a smell of gravity and finality. For Lincoln, the darkness was a sanctuary. Above ground, he was the president, the target, the orator. Down here, he was simply the man responsible, seeking the truth unvarnished by public expectation. Tonight, he is expecting General Meade's aid, carrying the final coded assessment of the aftermath of Fredericksburg, a defeat that has left a bloody stain on the Union's soul. The general cannot be seen arriving at the White House at this hour. The psychological impact of his hurried, secret appearance would be disastrous to public morale. As they reach the midpoint of the tunnel, a small, recessed steel door, heavy, reinforced, barely noticeable, waits for them. The aide gives a specific, intricate signal. 3 slow raps, 1 fast, 2 soft. A moment of silence. Then the grinding of steel bolts, and the door opens to reveal the weary, mud-splattered face of the general's aide, shivering less from the cold than from the sheer horror of the battlefield. It was here, in that cold, damp sub-room, the true silent war room, that the strategies for Antietam, Gettysburg, and the relentless pressure campaigns were often finalized, far from prying eyes. The papers are quickly passed, the cipher keys exchanged, the plans read aloud in a low conspiratorial murmur. The darkness was the shield of our strategy. Beyond intelligence, the tunnels provided the invaluable currency of absolute secrecy for diplomacy. We desperately needed the European powers, Britain, France, to stay out of our internal conflict. If they recognized the Confederacy, the Union would shatter. Lincoln met with key foreign envoys, not in the stateroom where every guest was noted, but in one of those small, windowless sub-rooms connected directly to the tunnel system. The envoys, often cloaked and brought in under the cover of darkness through the treasury side, would enter and depart as ghosts. No one knew who was coming, who was staying, or what terms, often desperate compromises, hard-won victories, were being discussed. Imagine the British ambassador, a man accustomed to the grand salons of London, finding himself seated on a simple wooden bench in a cramped, damp-smelling room beneath the American Capitol, negotiating with the president of a nation fighting for its very existence. The atmosphere of secrecy itself heightened the gravity of the talks. The pressure on the Union was immense, and the tunnels gave Lincoln the leverage of control, the power to manage perceptions while truly managing the crisis. The tunnels did not just save him from potential harm, they empowered him to save the Union. They were his silent iron hand, grasping the threads of war in the subterranean darkness, keeping our fragile, bleeding body together until the dawn of victory. The tunnels truly came into their own during the global cataclysms of the 20th century, transforming from secret roots into a genuine fortified command structure. The presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt ushered in the era of total, coordinated subterranean defense. When World War II engulfed the globe, the threat of air raids, though remote, was a terrifyingly real strategic consideration. The vulnerability of the capital, the epicenter of the free world, was unacceptable. FDR, with his unshakable resolve, ordered the construction of the infamous Presidential Emergency Operations Center, PEOC. This wasn't merely a new basement, it was an expansion and modernization of the deepest existing Eastern Tunnel network positioned directly beneath the East Wing. It was a massive, secretive engineering endeavor conducted during a time of national despair and global conflict. The very air during its construction in the early 1940s was thick with the dust of pulverized concrete and the smell of steel being welded, a sound that was muffled and hidden from the public ear, but was the glorious, defiant music of our preparation. The workers, sworn to absolute secrecy, toiled around the clock, creating a structure engineered not just to survive a conventional attack, but to withstand the weight of a collapsing city. This subterranean stronghold became the epicenter of the free world struggle. Deep below the manicured elegance of the White House gardens, the PEOC hummed with a low, constant energy. The walls were inches thick with reinforced concrete. The ventilation was scrubbed and sealed against gas attack. It was the physical manifestation of our absolute resolve, a steel and concrete fortress ready to assume command even if the world above crumbled. This was the true war room beneath the Rose Garden. It was through secured communication lines physically routed through these very tunnels and encased in steel conduit,
that FDR communicated with Churchill and Stalin. He would be wheeled down in the middle of the night, sometimes spending hours on end in the low-ceilinged security of the command post, his voice booming with confidence over the Atlantic wires, while his actual physical presence was buried in the protective shield of the Earth. The tunnels ensured secrecy in a time of leaks. The Manhattan Project, the D-Day plans, the decisions to deploy new technologies that would irrevocably alter the course of history, these were secrets that, if compromised, could lose the war and potentially cost millions of American lives. The tunnels provided secure, unobserved access for the scientists, generals, and codebreakers who had to brief the commander-in-chief directly. They bypassed the main gate, the guards, and the ever-present press pool, arriving and departing as ghosts in the night. Their information safe behind the thick, blast-proof doors. Imagine the contrast. The world above struggling with rationing and endless fear. The world below, a crucible of genius and terrifying power. A physicist like Oppenheimer, his mind reeling with the destructive potential he held, being rushed through a dark, cramped passage to meet the only man who could authorize its use. The secrecy was suffocating, necessary, and profoundly American. The tunnels, now hardened with steel doors, reinforced concrete, and modern ventilation systems, were no longer just a way out. They were the way to maintain absolute centralized authority during the most existential crisis we had ever faced. They represent the moment our nation accepted the full weight of global leadership, doing the hard, ugly, essential work of war in the unglamorous cold of the earth. The Cold War, that long, tense, twilight struggle between freedom and totalitarianism, elevated the importance of the subterranean network to its highest, most dramatic peak. This was the age of mutually assured destruction, where the threat was not a torch-bearing army, but a missile launched from thousands of miles away, capable of ending human civilization in 30 minutes. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, the world held its breath. For 13 days, the fate of human civilization rested on the decisions made by President John F. Kennedy and his inner circle, the ExComm, Executive Committee of the National Security Council. And where were those decisions primarily made? Not in the airy, sunlit rooms of the West Wing, which felt suddenly too exposed, too vulnerable, but within the deep, reinforced security of the tunnels. The PEOC and the interconnecting passages became quite literally the real White House. The atmosphere in that bunker was a physical manifestation of historical weight. It was thick with cigar and cigarette smoke, stale air despite the scrubbers, and the sheer palpable anxiety of men tasked with avoiding a nuclear war. The fluorescent lights buzzed with a low, nervous energy. The only other sound was the low, steady hum of the ventilation machinery and the rhythmic, terrifying clatter of the teletypes delivering raw intelligence data. The tunnels served as the decision crucible. President Kennedy, barely in his 40s, paced the cramped quarters, seeking momentary solitude in the short connecting passages, the only place he could think without being watched or pressured. The walls were thick enough to withstand a blast. The command structure was instantaneous and robust. The president and his advisors knew that if the unthinkable happened, this dark concrete box was the last best hope for them to rally the remaining forces of the American will and impose order on a world gone mad. It was here they debated the blockade versus the invasion, the costs of action versus the price of inaction. Every word spoken was a piece of history, weighted with the knowledge that outside the air was clean, the sun was shining, and nobody suspected that the fate of billions was being decided by a dozen tired men arguing in the dim light of an underground room.
The tunnels were also the lifeline to NORAD. The communications hub within the PEOC was the hardened, secure link to the North American Aerospace Defense Command and the Strategic Air Command, SAC. The red phones and encrypted lines that gave the president instant, direct, and uninterceptable access to the military chain of command were physically rooted in the subterranean complex. If a missile launched, the warning would come through those conduits. The response would be ordered from that room. The tunnels were not just protecting the men, they were protecting the flow of constitutional authority. They were the physical cables tethering command to consequence. They are a glorious testament to our nation's commitment to prudence and planning. We as a people faced the possibility of total obliteration, and we didn't simply pray for the best. We prepared for the worst, creating a sanctuary of command, and in doing so, we averted a nuclear catastrophe. The silent tunnels did their duty, holding the pressure of the world on their ancient, reinforced shoulders, allowing the light of liberty to persist in the deepest dark. The long, tense vigil of the Cold War eventually subsided, but the need for the tunnels did not. They were not designed for one enemy, but for the principle of unbroken command. The world changed fundamentally on September 11, 2001. The enemy was no longer a state with conventional arms or nuclear missiles pointed across an ocean. It was an invisible, decentralized network of hatred that turned our own infrastructure, our planes, into weapons. On that horrific morning, when the skies over our capital were filled with terror and uncertainty, and the Pentagon was struck, the secret tunnels performed their duty with brutal, immediate efficiency. The sight of a plume of smoke rising from the defense headquarters was the sign. The system was active. The immediate protocol for the president's security detail was to move the chief executive to a secure, undisclosed location, a procedure practiced countless times in the tunnels. Simultaneously, key White House staff, the essential civilian and military decision-makers, were rapidly deployed into the PEOC beneath the East Wing. The tunnels once again became the instrument of unbroken command, proving their relevance in the face of a new, decentralized adversary. Imagine the scene. Chaos above, the sounds of distant sirens and jet fighters, but below, silent, immediate action. Staff members, including policy advisors, military aides, and communication specialists, were rushed through the familiar steel-lined corridors of stone. The network ensured that, even as the buildings around the Capitol were cleared and evacuation orders were issued, the entire constitutional and defense command structure remained intact, operational, and secure, ready to respond to the next wave of attack. The old, damp brick passages of Hoban's time have long since been enveloped by the new, hardened architecture. In the years following 9/11, the system was upgraded again, a vast, expensive, and profoundly necessary project. It transformed those historical passages into state-of-the-art, secure fiber-optic conduits and fortified walkways. They became arteries for data as much as for people, ensuring not only physical security, but digital continuity in an age of cyber warfare. The ancient stone now cradles miles of shielded cable, carrying the most sensitive communications of the modern world. Today, the White House tunnels represent more than just escape routes. They are the physical embodiment of the doctrine of the Constitution's eternality. They exist to ensure that no matter the assault, be it military, cyber, or bioterror, the executive branch of our government, the embodiment of our collective we, can always function, always communicate, and always lead. The tunnels are our promise to ourselves. The Republic will not falter. We must recognize that the creation and maintenance of this secret world came at a cost, not just financial, but human. The men and women who designed, dug, built, and maintained these tunnels and bunkers were and remain the quiet custodians of our freedom.
They are the unseen engineers who tested the air scrubbers in the 1950s, the electricians who ran the emergency power during the blackouts, the maintenance crew who walked the lonely passages every night for 2 centuries checking for structural weakness, water seepage, or intrusion. Their dedication is as much a part of the glorious American story as any battlefield victory. They lived in the shadows so that our leaders could command in the dark, and so that our nation could shine in the light. The tunnels are a hidden history of American foresight, a chronicle of the moments when we, as a people, refused to be victims of fate. They are a library of silence, holding the echoes of every panicked whisper, every decisive command, and every sigh of relief. The White House stands majestic, bathed in the floodlights of democracy, a symbol of openness and transparency that invites the world to look upon our experiment. But beneath its polished floors and velvet ropes lies the truth of our national resilience. A network of stone and steel, built by nervous architects, preserved by courageous first ladies, utilized by wartime presidents, and ultimately hardened by the relentless necessity of survival. They are the hidden bones of the nation. They whisper of the immense burdens carried, the agonizing secrets kept, and the unflinching courage required to maintain the longest-running experiment in self-government the world has ever known. The secret tunnels of the White House are not a symbol of fear, but a monument to our enduring strength. They remind us that for every glorious public victory, there is a quiet, necessary act of preservation carried out in the dark. And that, my friends, is why we, the American people, endure. We are anchored in the bedrock. Our dream is safe, hidden just below the surface, waiting always for the call to command. We will always be ready,